How do we move? This is something that has not been very well talked about in the industry, and so I'm hoping I'm going to make it simple for you and give you a good ballpark picture, because we have a very incomplete view of it in the industry. First off, there's a big word called sensory motor integration. We produce contractions and movements, both voluntary and through reflexive processes. And it's all determined by incoming sensory information. That's basically stressors. So any sensation, so our vision, our sight, our balance, all these things, the vestibular, all of this reception comes in, but especially from the proprioceptors. Proprioceptors are little receptors, and one of the biggest ones that we're going to talk about, and I'll show you, give you research and all that great stuff, is the muscle spindle. Muscle spindles are vital as a proprioceptor because it gives feedback to the central nervous system. And based on that feedback and all this information that we give the brain, it then processes it and it determines what proper movement strategy or motor response. And that's like, what motor units or muscles am I going to activate, and to what degree can I do that in order to produce a movement? Extremely important. The keynote: we move based on feedback received from our receptors, especially the proprioceptors, especially a muscle spindle or the muscle spindles. Okay. Good feedback coming in means good movement going out. Bad or altered feedback coming in is going to produce bad or altered movement going out. So we need to be able to, how do we assess that and how can we address that? So let's talk about the muscle spindles. So first off, muscle spindles have been noted as being the most important proprioceptor. Not that the others aren't important, but the spindles are the most important because of the function they perform and because of where they're located, because the muscular system is extremely vital and intimately connected with every other system in the body. As your muscular system goes, so does the health of the body. And they're finding out more and more information about this that I can't go into right now, but I assure you. What they do is they inform the central nervous system whether or not muscle fibers, motor units, which are components of muscles, are online or not. Are they online, able to work right now? Yes or no? That's what it tells the brain. If they're working correctly, yes. If they're not working correctly, no. They're sensitive, and here's another key. This is what's not talked about in the industry. Muscle spindles are sensitive to change in muscle's length. They're always called a stretch receptor, and that's technically incomplete. They are a length regulator. They are a length receptor because they work both long when the muscles lengthen and shortened, or the fibers lengthen and shorten. And the shortening is actually vitally important, more so than just the lengthening if we had to pick one. Muscles have to shorten for any type of movement to occur. And this is what's not talked about. We are in a stretch dominant industry or philosophy in the industry. Everything's about how long can we get a muscle? How much range of motion do we have in the muscle? What we forget is that in order for range of motion to occur, things have to lengthen and shorten. We only think about lengthening. In order for anything, any joint, any movement to occur, something has to shorten in order for something to lengthen. We don't look at the shorten, we just think, hey, can we pull this? Can we push that? Can we move that to a longer state? Thinking that's going to help, but we're not understanding the neurophysiology behind it, and we're getting an incomplete recovery process. And that's why we have a lot of reoccurring and chronic injuries that never go away, which is also why we have a lot of YouTube videos and Instagram videos of doing weird things that don't have to happen. Okay, so for muscles to shorten, whether actively or passively, whether we actively control them and use our nervous system to move them, or whether we passively move that, for them to shorten like that, the muscle spindles, which is the feedback to the nervous system, must be functioning properly. Even if you passively move someone, the muscle spindle in the muscles that have to shorten have to be able to shorten as well. If they don't, then we have a system that's offline, and I'll show you what happens as we go into that later. So The way that this works for the muscle spindle and the muscle, and why they're so intimately connected, because they're intimately connected. Muscle spindles are directly connected and coordinated. They're synced up with the muscle fibers. So we have the little spindle that's within, it's embedded in muscle fibers, and there's dozens, hundreds of them, depending on the muscle. And that's what's feeding information to the nervous system. So we can see here that the muscle spindle, which is on the right-hand side, it's that little oblong shaped with the spiral around it. The muscle spindle provides feedback to the central nervous system about the muscle's length and activity. What's happening to the muscle? Is it lengthening? Is it shortening? So it's feeding, remember, sensory motor integration that we talked about. We only move based upon the feedback that we get. If the feedback's good, we move good. If it's not good, we won't move good. This feedback is used for the sensory motor integration and also for something called reciprocal inhibition, which is extremely important. We're going to get to that next. To tell the muscles when to lengthen and shorten and how much to do it. So that spindle, and by the way, this is one of the main pathways that the body uses to give us proprioception. Proprioception is one of those fancy words, and what proprioception actually means is stability. Proprioception means we have proper information coming in so we can have proper information going out. And if we have good proprioception, that means we have instant joint stability. We have proper activation so joints are stable. It's an unstable joint that causes the musculoskeletal injuries is essentially what happens. And I'm going to break that down here in a minute. If we have proper proprioception input coming into the system so it can go out clearly, we have good muscle activation, good timing. It means things are turning on when they're supposed to and turning off when they're supposed to. That creates a stable joint, and that allows for full range of motion. So range of motion is dictated by the proprioception. So the keynote here is that when we have this happening, we have reciprocal inhibition, proper and functional reciprocal inhibition. So the alpha gamma coactivation means when the spindle is moving, it's telling the muscle what it should be doing. When the muscle moves, the spindle moves. When the spindle moves, the muscle moves. The muscle can only do what the spindle will allow it to do, especially in a shortened capacity. Okay, so they're connected. Alpha just means those are the motor neurons that are going to the muscle fibers, and gamma are the neurons going to the muscle, and the gamma neurons are going from the spindle to the nervous system and back to the spindle. So those two things have to work together. They're in concert. If not, then we have poor information. Okay, so reciprocal inhibition. Reciprocal inhibition is when the muscle spindle is sending information to the brain, like we just talked about, to tell the muscles what to do. And in this case, when we talk about the reciprocal inhibition component, it's when muscle fibers and their spindles shorten, the opposing muscle is allowed to lengthen. So think of this diagram right here. This is an overly simplistic information, but let's keep it very simple. If I take that bent knee, and whether they actively extend it or whether I passively extend it, either way, that quad, that muscle, it has to shorten. As long as the spindle can shorten, and the spindle has to be able to shorten in order for the muscle to shorten. It's not the muscle shortens and then the spindle catches up. It's the spindle is able to shorten and then the muscle will continue to shorten. As long as that happens, then that hamstring or the opposing musculature will be allowed to lengthen because the brain will reciprocally inhibit the other muscle, the hamstring muscle, when the quad is shortening. So as long as information from that spindle says we're shortening, we're shortening, we're shortening, we're shortening, shooting it to the spinal cord or to the central nervous system, it'll send an impulse down to the opposing muscle saying, go ahead and lengthen, go ahead and lengthen, go ahead and lengthen. It's basically turning the volume knob down of the activation for the opposing musculature, the hamstring in this case, as long as the spindle is working. So that's one of the keys here. As long as the nervous system is receiving input from the muscle spindle that the muscle is shortening, the opposing muscles will be allowed to lengthen to a full range of motion. The keynote: muscle spindle function dictates muscle activation and range of motion. As the spindle goes, so goes the activation of the muscles, meaning was something turning on so something could turn off? Was the quad turning on, the spindle turning on? Was it able to send information so the hamstring could turn off? If so, we have full range of motion of that knee extension. Vitally important. And then last, we have something called the size principle, and this is another key factor. So we have different sizes of muscle fibers and motor units. Muscle fibers make up motor units. Motor units are just the muscle fibers and the nerves the nerve that activates it. So just think you have a nerve and it activates so many fibers, that's a motor unit. There's type 1, type 2A, type 2X, type 2B, in essence. Those are the general forms. Type 2-1s have the lowest activation threshold. They have to activate first. The reason this is important is because, well, one, it's a lower threshold that they have to activate on. So each of those come in at different places. When we have what we call motor unit recruitment, type 1 comes in first. When things get over 30%, then type 2A kicks in. And then when we get over about 60-65%, type 2X, and then we get over about 80-85%, then type 2B kick in. And then there's summation and there's synchronization, there's all that stuff. So there's all these different things that we have the ability to increase the activation so we can have proper activation what we have. But if the type 1s have to activate first, they are vitally important because they are what immediately are stimulated to have instant contraction, either immediately or prior to the joint going through motion, to create that proprioceptive feedback, which is stability, so the joint is stable. They must activate immediately. That is essential for joint stabilization. And they have to remain active throughout the contraction, depending on, and it doesn't matter what it is, because that's how we increase either how much input's getting into those muscle fibers or how many of them are being recruited based on load and activity, whatever. So they're low threshold, instant activation, essential for joint stabilization, and they have to remain active.